The first time the lights flickered, everyone laughed it off. It was almost midnight, and the office was empty, save for a handful of employees trying to meet an impossible deadline. The click of keyboards and the hum of the air conditioning were the only sounds echoing through the vast, dimly lit workspace. Sara leaned back in her chair, rolling her neck to ease the tension that had settled between her shoulders. She glanced at the small clock on her desk. 11:57 p.m. The red glow seemed to pulsate slightly, a rhythmic reminder that she had been working too late, too often. She could barely remember the last time she'd seen daylight outside of the glass walls of the office building. "You guys want to order food?" called out Mike, his voice muffled from behind his cubicle partition. Sara could hear the weariness in his tone. They all were running on fumes, surviving on cold coffee and vending machine snacks. "Sure," Sara replied, her voice echoing faintly across the empty room. She sighed and returned her eyes to her computer screen, but something caught her attention, a shadow, moving just out of the corner of her vision. She snapped her head up, but there was nothing there. Just the same vacant desks and gray partitions. "You okay, Sara?" asked Jenna, her coworker, whose cubicle faced Sara's. She had noticed Sara's sudden flinch, her eyes wide for a second, before she forced a smile. "Yeah, I thought I saw something," Sara said, chuckling lightly. "Probably just my mind playing tricks on me." Jenna nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. "Maybe we should just call it a night. This place gives me the creeps after dark." Sara had to agree. The building was old, and there was something unsettling about how the night took away its warmth. During the day, the office was a bustling hive of productivity phones ringing, meetings taking place, laughter echoing during breaks. But at night, it transformed into a hollow, silent entity, as if the energy had drained away, leaving behind only shadows and an odd, empty coldness. The next day, Sara told herself it was just her imagination, a combination of exhaustion, stress, and the eerie quiet of the office at night. But deep down, she knew something was off. There was a presence in that building, something that lurked in the dark, feeding on their fears. It started small, a chair that was pushed back when no one had been there, the printer turning on by itself, spitting out blank sheets of paper, Jenna's screensaver, peaceful beach scene glitching, replaced by static, and then the dark silhouette of a figure standing far off in the distance. "This place is seriously haunted," Jenna said one afternoon, her voice half joking, but her eyes betraying her nervousness. "I swear, I keep seeing things." Mike looked up from his work, smirking. "Ghosts, huh? Maybe it's just your guilty conscience." "Shut up, Mike," Jenna shot back, but her laugh was strained. Sara couldn't ignore it any longer. The whispers, the flickering lights, the feeling of being watched, too real. And it was getting worse. Over the following weeks, the presence in the office grew bolder. The night shift became unbearable, with whispers echoing through the halls, the printer going haywire, and the shadows moving where they shouldn't. Employees began calling in sick, refusing to stay late. Sara, Mike, and Jenna were the last ones left, the only ones still desperate enough to finish the project that had consumed their lives. But even they were reaching their breaking point. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, the lights went out completely. The office was plunged into darkness, and a silence fell over them, thick and heavy. Sarah's breath hitched as she fumbled for her phone, the glow of the screen barely piercing the blackness. "Guys," she called out, her voice trembling. "Mike, Jenna." There was no answer, only the soft sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. Coming closer, Sarah's hands shook as she turned on her phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. She swept it across the office, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Just the empty desks, the shadows, the silence. And then she saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the row, its face obscured by darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted to the side as if observing her. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as the figure moved, gliding towards her without a sound. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering, her heart pounding in her ears. Jenna, Mike, she screamed, her voice breaking. But there was no response, only the shadow, growing closer, its presence suffocating. The last thing she remembered was the cold and icy chill that enveloped her, seeping into her bones as the darkness swallowed her whole. Sara awoke in darkness. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive weight that made her feel as though she was deep underground. Her head throbbed as she blinked, her eyes slowly adjusting to the faintest hint of light leaking in from a crack under a door far ahead. She realized she was lying on the floor, surrounded by shadows that twisted and shifted unnaturally. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, trying to push herself up. Her body felt numb, her limbs sluggish, as though she had been in that icy chill for hours. She struggled to her feet, her hands trembling as she clutched at the edge of a nearby desk for support. Everything looked familiar, but distorted, like a bad dream where the details refused to stay put. The office was silent, but there was a sense of movement, of things slipping just out of view whenever she tried to focus. "Jenna, Mike," she called, her voice weak. There was no response. The office was completely still, as though she was the only living thing left. The light from her phone had died, leaving her with only the dim glow seeping from that one distant door. She took a deep breath and started moving, her footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. She made her way past cubicles that seemed to stretch on endlessly, the familiar path now feeling alien and wrong. The door led to the hallway, different one than where the storage room had been. This door was older, the wood warped, and the handle cold to the touch. She twisted it and pushed it open, her breath held in anticipation. The hallway beyond was empty, save for a row of flickering emergency lights along the ceiling. The flickering made her stomach turn, and she hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to find Jenna and Mike. She had to get out. As she stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang, and the sound echoed, making her jump. She turned back, but the door had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall, its surface smooth and featureless. Panic began to rise in her chest, her pulse racing. She took a shaky step forward, and then another. her breath coming in shallow gasps. As she walked, she became aware of the whispers again, soft and indistinct, seeming to come from all around her. Sara and Sara. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to fill her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She clamped her hands over her ears, her eyes shut tight as she stumbled down the hall. The lights above her flickering faster and faster until they finally went out, plunging her into complete darkness. She stopped, her heart hammering in her chest, and slowly opened her eyes. The hallway was dark, but there, at the far end, she saw them two figures, standing motionless, their faces hidden in shadow. "Jenna, Mike," she called out, her voice breaking. The figures didn't move, didn't respond. They just stood there, watching her. And then, without warning, they started to move, gliding silently towards her, their shapes blurring and shifting as they drew closer. Sara turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the cold floor. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from inside her head, urging her to stop, to turn around, to give in. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to find a way out. Ahead, she saw another door. This one, metal, with a small window set into it. She reached it just as the figures closed in, their cold presence pressing in on her from all sides. She grabbed the handle, yanking the door open, and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind her. She found herself in the stairwell, the concrete walls cold and unwelcoming. She collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in sobs, her entire body trembling. She had no idea how much longer she could keep running. She had to find a way out before whatever was haunting this place caught her for good. Sara forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The stairwell was dimly lit, the emergency lights barely illuminating the steps that spiraled downwards. She glanced upward, but the darkness above seemed infinite, as though the stairs led nowhere but deeper into the void. The only option was down. She placed her hand on the cold, rough surface of the railing and started to descend. Each step felt like an eternity, her heart pounding with every echoing footfall. The whispers had faded, but the silence that replaced them was almost worse, a void, filled only by the sound of her own breathing. She could feel the air growing colder as she descended, a chill that seeped into her skin. The stairs seemed endless, and her sense of direction began to blur. She lost track of how many floors she had passed, the monotony of the spiraling steps blending together. She paused for a moment, trying to catch her breath, and that was when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping from below. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath caught, her ears straining to locate the source. The sound was distant, but it was growing louder, moving upward, closer. Sara's stomach twisted with dread. She knew she couldn't stay here, waiting for whatever was coming. She hurried down the steps, her heart racing, her footsteps mingling with the relentless tapping. It echoed through the stairwell, growing louder and louder, until it seemed as if it was just a floor away. Then, mere steps. She glanced back, her flashlight flickering, and for a split second, she saw Ita's shadow, moving up the stairs, each step deliberate and slow. Panic surged through her veins, and she turned, almost tripping as she rushed down the steps, her hand gripping the railing for support. The stairwell twisted endlessly, and she could feel her strength waning, her legs burning with exertion. She didn't know how much longer she could keep running. Then she saw a door, labeled basement. It was heavy, reinforced with a worn handle. She lunged for it, her hands trembling as she yanked it open and stepped through, slamming it shut behind her. The basement was dark and cold, a vast open space filled with the faint hum of machinery. She could see rows of shelves, stacked with old office supplies, forgotten and gathering dust. The air was damp, the smell of mildew thick. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving, trying to gather her thoughts. Suddenly, she heard a creak from within the basement, a slow, deliberate sound, like a footstep on an old wooden floor. Her eyes widened, and she turned her head slowly towards the source of the noise. There, just beyond the edge of the nearest shelf, she saw movement, a shadow, slipping out of sight as she tried to focus on it. Her heart pounded, and she took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the basement. "Jenna, Mike," she whispered, her voice trembling, though she knew deep down that whatever was here with her wasn't either of them. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Then the whispers returned, soft and mocking, as though they were all around her. "Sara, you can't hide." She spun around, her back pressing against a shelf, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel her sanity slipping, the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, the shadows inching closer. She needed to find a way out, but the basement seemed to stretch on endlessly, the exit nowhere in sight. And then she saw a faint light, seeping from under a door at the far end of the basement. She didn't know where it led, but it was her only chance. She pushed herself away from the shelf and began to move, her steps careful and quiet, her eyes never leaving the shifting shadows that seemed to follow her every move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they knew she was trying to escape. The shadows moved with purpose now, darting between the shelves, always just out of sight. Sara's heart pounded, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she reached the door, her hand closing around the cold metal handle. She twisted it, the door creaking as it opened, and she slipped through, closing it behind her as quickly and quietly as she could. The room she found herself in was small and cluttered, an old maintenance room, with tools hanging from the walls and a single flickering bulb overhead. For a moment, the whispers stopped, the silence almost deafening in its intensity. She collapsed against the wall, her body trembling, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up, how much longer she could evade whatever was stalking her. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't give up. Not yet. Not until she found Mike and Jenna. Not until she found a way out of this nightmare. The flickering light overhead provided little comfort. Sara could hear her own heart pounding in her ears, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The door to the maintenance room was her only barrier, but she knew it wouldn't hold forever, not against whatever was lurking in the basement. She needed to find Jenna and Mike. They had to be somewhere, and she couldn't just leave them. With trembling hands, she picked up a rusted wrench from the workbench nearby. It wasn't much, but it made her feel slightly less helpless. She couldn't keep running forever. Maybe, just maybe, she could fight back. She pushed herself off the wall and headed to the door, wrench clutched tightly in her hand. She opened it slowly, peering out into the dimly lit basement. The shadows seemed to writhe, shifting with a life of their own, and the whispers resumed, soft and malicious. "Sara, why do you fight?" She ignored them, stepping carefully into the open space. The light from the maintenance room threw long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. She forced herself to keep moving, each step careful, deliberate. The faint light from the door at the far end of the basement was still there, a beacon in the darkness. She moved towards it, her eyes scanning every inch of the basement as she went. The air seemed to grow thicker, colder, the closer she got to the door. The whispers became louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices coming from all directions. Suddenly, she heard a soft rustling, like someone shifting their weight. She spun around, her heart in her throat, and for a moment, she saw them. Two figures standing among the shelves, their faces obscured by darkness. "Jenna, Mike," she called out, her voice breaking, hope and fear battling within her. The figures stepped forward, and she could see them more clearly now. It was them, Jenna and Mike. Their eyes were wide, vacant, their skin pale as if drained of life. They moved in unison, slow and deliberate, their mouths opening as if to speak. "Sara," they whispered in unison, their voices hollow, empty. Sara's heart twisted with fear and sadness. This wasn't them. This couldn't be them. She took a step back, her grip tightening on the wrench. The figures advanced, their expressions void of recognition, as if they were being controlled. "Please, don't make me do this," Sara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But they kept coming, their footsteps slow, relentless. The shadows around them seemed to pulse, growing darker, more menacing. The whispers in her head grew louder, almost unbearable. She knew she had no choice. With a sob, she swung the wrench, the metal connecting with Mike's arm. He stumbled back, his face expressionless, and Jenna reached out for her, her fingers cold as they brushed against Sara's skin. Sara swung again, her vision blurring with tears, her heart breaking. She had to fight, she had to survive. She pushed past them, her body trembling as she ran towards the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. She could hear them behind her, their footsteps growing louder, the shadows pressing in from all sides. With a cry, she yanked the door open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind her. Sara found herself in a narrow hallway, the walls lined with old pipes and wires. A dim, flickering light hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows. She could still hear the whispers, muffled now, but still present, like a distant echo that refused to fade. She took a moment to catch her breath, her body aching, her mind racing. She had made it this far, she couldn't give up now. She looked down the hallway, and at the far end, she saw another door, this one marked with an emergency exit sign. Hope surged within her, and she pushed herself forward, her legs heavy, her steps slow. The whispers seemed to grow fainter the closer she got to the door, as if the presence that haunted the office was losing its grip. She reached the door, her hand closing around the handle, and she pushed it open. Cold night air rushed in, and she gasped, tears streaming down her face. She stepped outside, the cool breeze washing over her, the stars twinkling above. She was outside, the nightmare was finally over. She turned, looking back at the building, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer reaching for her. She could feel the weight lifting from her chest, the cold leaving her bones. But as she stood there, she knew she couldn't leave Jenna and Mike behind, not like this. She would come back with help. She would find out what had happened in that building, and she would make sure that whatever haunted it would never hurt anyone again. With one last glance at the dark, towering structure, she turned and walked away, her steps slow but steady. The night was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She was free for now.